Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the Festival Director. Over the coming months, we look forward to sharing with you the audio recordings from the 2022 festival. FODI started in 2009 and is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival. FODI exists to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. While we've all watched the rise of the US in our lifetime, its recent decline has been a hot topic of conversation. With ballooning inequality, military overreach, gun violence and police shootings, the Great Recession and a dramatic slide into division, America seems to have reached a tipping point. While the idea of a slightly less powerful America might be attractive to many countries, can we reach the conclusion that America has gone into irreversible decline? Join historian Ruth Ben-Ghiat, journalist Nick Bryant and economic commentator Adam Tooze in this panel discussion chaired by journalist Geraldine Doogue from FODI 2022. Please enjoy American Decadence.
Hello there, I'm Geraldine Doogue. Welcome. I was about to ask you to act up a storm because we're going to put this to air next Saturday on Saturday Extra, but you don't need prompting. So I'll be your host today for this session, which I think will be fantastic and very enlightening and quite prescient and perfect for a festival of dangerous ideas. American Decadence and Decline, a question mark should be at the end of that. I think it's a pretty vital old question mark. We've all watched the great rise of the US in our lifetimes. Are we now in the perhaps uncomfortable box seat of watching its fall? What if America has gone too far into decline to come back to anything like its former reliability? Now, of course, for Australia, which has more or less bet the farm on the fact that we will be protected by the US, this has a particular salience for us. So I'm going to be very interested in hearing my guests discuss this, and I'm delighted to welcome Adam Tooze, who is an historian and an economic commentator, although that's a bit of an understatement given that his chart book Substack has made depth economics very sexy indeed. His most recent book is Shutdown: How COVID Shook the World's Economy. It's an account of 2020, as he says, more or less the year that changed everything. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is an historian too. She's a specialist commentator on fascism, authoritarian leaders and propaganda and the threats these present to democracies today. Her book, Strong Men, From Mussolini to the Present, looks at how illiberal leaders use a particular set of weapons, which she thinks is being used today as well in the US, and she'll explain why. Nick Bryant is a former distinguished BBC correspondent, a Cambridge history graduate with a doctorate in US politics from Oxford. And his book, When America Stopped Being Great, A History of the Present, apparently made it onto Joe Biden's bookshelf in the Oval Office, so I presume that that was to his great delight and hopefully to book sales as well. And his Journo podcast, we were just talking about it outside via the Judith Neilson Institute, is absolutely required listening. So will you please welcome our guests? Look, the question we are going to wrestle with today is whether the US is reaching some sort of tipping point into irreversible decline. And we really will wrestle with this. And I want to ask you first, Adam, is that what you see happening or not quite?
I'm one of those people that wrote a premature obituary of the Biden administration early in the summer that has left me somewhat haunted, to be honest. Because I thought there that I saw the outlines, basically, of a train wreck administration that was going to go down in flames in the midterms. And I kind of extrapolated from there. And that's left me a little bit shaken. The American political system is astonishingly unpredictable and difficult to read. And there is a temptation, I think, to overinterpret moves. But having said that, I'm just going to put that on the table in full disclosure. I think on this topic I'm sort of torn in two different directions. On the one hand, at the level of politics, congressional politics, the electoral system, the development of politics also at the state level, which is crucial to understand in the US. Guys, it's such a huge entity that the developments, say, in Texas are very telling with regard, I'm sure we'll talk about them. At that level, I think it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that it's an increasingly dysfunctional and indeed dangerous system, as Ruth has been alerting us to. But then if I put my other hat on and think in terms of functional structures of power in the world and how they operate, whether you look at the tech pillar, if you like, or if you look at the military pillar, or if you look at the bit which concerns me most directly, finance and the dollar, American power remains, almost through its crises, it tends to be reinforced. So you could think of Ukraine as a failure of deterrence, and what happens, it reaffirms the position of America as the military provider of last resort. You can think of 2008 as a catastrophic failure of the North Atlantic banking system. What does it do? It confirms the Fed as the de facto central bank to the world. 2020 underwrites that again. So there's a way in which failing for lack of alternatives demonstrates America's indispensability, but at this functional level. And I think maybe one way of describing the crisis is as a gap between what you might think of as like political hegemonic functions, in other words, providing meaning and cohering everything, the way America did around the Marshall Plan, for instance, or in the Kennedy moment, or even in the Reagan neoliberal moment. You could say there was a kind of charismatic, hegemonic project. The gap between that, which now I think is quite fundamentally ruptured. I mean, Biden's no Kennedy. Biden was at Kennedy's inauguration, for crying out loud, right? That's how old he is. Like, there's a gap between that just sort of increasing absurdity of the political dimension in the US and the persistent functional logics which tie not just Australia, but the Europeans, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, into the American system. And that might be one way of thinking about our current crisis.
Yes. It's sort of vaccinated. I read one quote, I don't think it was from your writing. It's almost as if America is vaccinated against its own decline through some of these structures. And we certainly saw that in all the, I thought it was amazing, in the January the 6th, the congressional hearings. We saw those remarkably heroic individual behaviours by people, Ruth, didn't we? Which did tend to say to oneself, yes, there are people who will go to the wall and they know what they have to do to defend the system. It was quite interesting to see.
Yeah, it's very moving. And I actually was interviewed twice by the January 6th committee. And as a first-generation American, I was incredibly proud to have been asked and to do this. And I wrote a report for them. And they were extremely well prepared, had all the big picture, knew what the risks were at the largest level. And I'm always thinking, when I see the hearings and the reports about what's going on, that we wouldn't have this if we weren't in a democracy. The places I study, you'd never have a January 6th hearing. It would be impossible. And I think that we're in this, it's been a whole learning curve how America was not prepared for the Trumpian assault on institutions, and they didn't see what he was until perhaps it was too late. But the resilience of, for example, the military, they were trying to get the military to have like to play his little coup attempt game, and they've refused. And so we're in it's a learning curve, and it's very heartening to see how institutions are stepping up and understanding the risks. And Biden's actually, as opposed to these strongmen I study who think they have all the answers, they don't consult with anyone. Biden is a very consultative president, and he's convening historians, economists, all kinds of people all the time, because we're in like a real-time learning experience of how to protect democracy. How to be
That
strong.
certainly doesn't sound like irreversible decline.
No, and I think the resilience and what Adam said, never, there's always a surprise. Some people thought that Biden would never win. And now we see, in reaction to what's going on with abortion rights, there's a huge surge of voter registration, of sensitization by women and men about the rights that you could lose. So things are ongoing. It's a very dynamic moment, and that's not decline.
No. Okay. Now, whereas Nick, your book title doesn't really leave a lot of doubt as to your thoughts. You think it has gone past a point.
I do. First of all, let me say, Geraldine, it's amazing you've managed to replicate the lighting effect at Independence Hall the other night when Biden gave that speech. The sort of when they managed to turn that American landmark into something like a Halloween House of Horrors. The lighting is so similar. Look, I'm always minded of something that the American humorist Andy Rooney once said. He said, America's always going to hell, but it never quite reaches it. But my concern at the moment is it's getting closer and closer. And that's been a process really that's being gone certainly at quite a rapid rate for the past 20 years and a slower rate for the 30 years before it. And my worry now is I was a very reluctant American declinist. I adore America. I found in America a place that I felt far more comfortable in than my homeland in Britain for all sorts of reasons, not least the sort of dynamism, not least this wonderful idea of social mobility. I really did buy into the American dream. And I kind of lived a form of that American dream myself. My dream was always to report on Washington for the BBC, and I managed to do that. And that was a great privilege. But I worry now that we've moved beyond decline, and we're talking about dismemberment. I worry that we're talking about two Americas, and those two Americas never really being able to come back together. I mean, I was stood 50 yards away from Joe Biden when he delivered his inaugural address. And I mean, the three words that we remember it for are democracy has prevailed. A statement uttered out of relief than any great sense of triumph, but it was three sentences that defined his presidential mission, and they were all about bringing the country back together, a reunification project. And, you know, very soon afterwards, it became clear that that reunification project was bound to fail. And it wasn't only the fault of Biden. There was no president who could have delivered an inaugural address that day or carried on a presidency that would bring America together. And that is my great fear now, and we can talk about how it's divided. But, you know, one of the reasons is you've got two parties now, and one is committed to democracy and one isn't. And that's a real worry and a huge worry. And one of the reasons I'm back in Australia not reporting on America, there's no shared truth anymore. And I was offered the chance to stay in America to keep reporting, but I really didn't want to spend the next 4 years arguing with Trump supporters about who'd won the 2020 election. No. And when you haven't got that shared truth, it's very difficult to have a united country.
I don't, because I know you love American history, you know, like FDR could have surely given a speech that would have drawn people together. I mean, is it right to say that no American president, nobody who lives now, you think, you could imagine with those techniques to do that? Is that what you mean?
I don't see how anybody has that capability of bringing together a country that simply cannot agree on a truth, which is manifestly obvious. You know, we can talk about all the historical reasons why FDR managed to do it. There wasn't the big... I mean, one of the reasons why FDR managed to bring the country together was that he managed to bring the Democratic Party together. The Democratic Party at that time was this strange amalgam of northern liberals and southern segregationists. And one of the big polarizing things that happened in America was the divide that was always more intense within the parties is now between the parties. And that happened in the 1960s after the 1964 Act. All these Southern Democrats became Republicans, which was historically anomalous because the Republicans were the party of Lincoln. FDR managed to bring America together partly because he managed to bring his party together. And you know, the stark differences between the parties now is one of the big problems.
I mean, I love the way you've just taken it, but doesn't that imply that really to think of American unity is really, it's an anomalous effect of the very crazy configuration of American party politics post-Civil War, right? That because it relies, these great moments that we think of as where America was the powerhouse hegemonic force, let's just take post-45 as that moment, is one in which you can stack economic policy, global power policy, cultural hegemony, and a solid domestic power base on top of each other. But that depends, as Ira Katznelson has shown, right, on this completely perverse alignment between northern liberals and southern segregationists. So you just take what is, in fact, a massively divisive society, one which systematically excludes 15 to 20% of the population from enfranchisement in a most egregious way, and build a party political fix for that. To call that a United States seems to me to, you know, be itself question-begging. Right now, American politics accurately reflects what is and always has been an incredibly polarized, starkly divided society.
I think that's the key point. You know, division has always been the default. And
but now something has happened to change this, in that Trump, it was a kind of authoritarian cult leader. And he's really, some of you will laugh at this, but he really is one of the most skilled propagandists of the early 21st century. People think he's a clown or he's lazy. He knows what he's doing, and he has created, think about the big lie. What a genius thing. Not only it was self-serving, it didn't work for him, he actually had to leave, but it allows anybody now to just be a little Trump, a mini Trump, and ignore elections. And it also kept his personality cult going, because it prevented his followers from having to accept that he lost the election. So he has weaponized division and polarization to a degree and created this cult authoritarian-style bond with his followers and with the Republican Party, which he's totally domesticated. It's unbelievable what he's been able to do. It's just for context, a lot of people who've had that degree of intense bonding, they created the party. Like Mussolini created a party, Berlusconi created a party. Trump came from outside to this grand old party, and in 4 short years completely domesticated it. By using authoritarian discipline, imposing. So much so that, I'm sure some of you know, you're not allowed to have any internal dissent in the Republican Party anymore. And some of the Republicans who voted to impeach Trump in February 2021, they had to buy body armor because they were being threatened. So there's a kind of a junta climate now in terms of political, violent threats inside the Republican Party. So when you've got those authoritarian dynamics, the kind of polarization is a whole other thing. It doesn't relate. It comes from history, but it's morphed into something else.
Well, in fact, I think it's very interesting to think about this, because I was going to come to this a little bit later about divisions, but it was a very good piece by that Financial Times writer, Yanan Ganesh, about politics being not just now something of mere interest, but it's a source of identity for a lot of people. And he had this great, you crave less a leader than a messianic shepherd to your flock. And he's saying Donald Trump, the atomizing force here might be the decline of unions or of religion. The rise of American partisanship more or less attracts the drop in church membership. I found that absolutely fascinating. Do you think there's something in that?
People don't even need to marry, right?
Is that right?
It's inconceivable that you could have,
Well, there's certainly something quasi-religious about Trump. I mean, 6 weeks after January the 6th, I flew down to Florida, where Trump was giving his first public address after the insurrection at the CPAC conference in Orlando. And the mood was one of a religious revival meeting. There was even a gold statue of Donald Trump. I mean, that's how reverential
Not with a halo,
it was.
I hope.
And this moment, which we hope would be the moment of Trumpian repudiation, and I think senior Republicans like Mitch McConnell hoped that January the 6th would be again. You remember he gave a very strongly critical speech at the end of Trump's second impeachment trial. But this became another moment of Republican radicalization.
Totally.
And the purge began very shortly afterwards. All those people, I think there are 10 of them, aren't there, in the House that voted for impeachment. I think 4 of them were forced to resign. I think 4 of them have been primaried out of existence, and only 2 survive now. Liz Cheney obviously being the classic example of that, purged from her leadership position in the House almost immediately afterwards. And, one of the problems for the Republican Party, we just have wave after wave of radicalization. We've spoken about this in the past, Geraldine. It begins with Goldwaterism in the 60s, you get Reaganism in the 80s, you get Gingrichism in the 90s after Newt Gingrich, the House Speaker, you get Tea Partyism and Palinism, and then you get Trumpism, and now you've got nihilism. And it's...
nihilism, you think?
Yeah, and it's really worrying. And, I don't think there's a... How do you de-radicalize the Republican Party? And I mean, just going back to what Ruth was saying about Trump, one of the great analytical cliches of 2015, 2016 was that Trump had mounted a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. It wasn't a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. It had massive buy-in from the grassroots.
Ruth, you're nodding here. Do you agree? I mean, well, I'm intrigued as to whether you can get it back from that, because that does portend declinism, it seems to me, if that's the case.
I mean, really, the GOP, and this is, for Americans, it's been hard to hear. I'm always going on TV talking about this. The referent for the GOP, the way it's transforming, is European far-right parties. There's a reason that Viktor Orban is like their mentor. He's constantly being invited to this conservative conference. They are going to Budapest. There's a huge interchange with European far-right parties and the GOP. And what they're learning is how to wreck democracy, how to be an electoral autocracy. So that's, and what's happening, what Nick was saying, is that you've got moderates going out, and if you look at who's coming in, what are the values of the future politicians, it's very frightening, because lawless and violent individuals are being encouraged to come into the party. So there are these extremist groups like Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. And there always was a situation where GOP politicians were sympathetic to them or would even, ally with them. Now those people are the GOP lawmakers.
It's not possible that they'll become more responsible by being in the tent?
No, and I think that when a party radicalizes to that extent and it's on the way to creating, it wants to be a party that supports autocracy. And if they can have success on the model of Hungary and other places that they're emulating, they will. Yeah,
as we heard in the weekend.
Sweden. Yeah, and they see it as riding the more sophisticated people who are the ones really there's a whole second fascist international going on, actually. They see it as riding the wave of the future. They don't see it as decline. They see it as rebirth of America. Unfortunately, it's at you have to kill democracy off.
Actually, just before we come to you, Adam, Bill Crystal, the Conservative commentator, made a very interesting point on a webinar I saw here the other day, which really made me think. He said, people think of the word fascism with a capital F, and very much, in the vein of Mussolini and Hitler and so on. But actually, his thesis was that fascism was, with a small f, was fundamentally a clever shapeshifter. That it shifted to populist need, and it's brilliantly adapted its message. So far from being absolutely sure that you could look and say, well, that's what Trump or others think, there's a constant adaptation, which makes it extremely difficult to rebut. Do you think that's a reasonable assessment, Adam?
Well, I think the fascism reference point is interesting, because was fascism decadent or declinist politics? And I think my answer to that would be almost certainly not, right? Because fascism addressed, in its own terms at least, two major historical features of the early 20th century world. The experience of total war, which was absolutely definitional for fascism, and what was understood to be, by groups in society, a fundamental and dangerous revolutionary challenge. And fascism, if you define its structural position, is the politics that answers those two questions. And my question, and it really is a question about America's current situation, is how does this ferment of far-right politics in the United States relate to structural questions which are analogous to those in the interwar period? I mean, clearly there is no American experience of total war. Instead, there's a fascination with America's experience of the forever wars, right? The tactical gear, the special forces stuff. That's not fascism. That's something else. It's militant, it's military, but it's not the fascist model of men and women, rank and file, hundreds of thousands of people. It's actually almost antithetical to that, because it's too individualist, libertarian. But it's there, but it's not the same. The even deeper question for me is, and the military, American military, that play a rather ambiguous role in the current situation. On the one hand, I agree it's good that we have some liberal American generals, and we'd be fortunate to have them. On the other hand, it's pretty fucking terrifying that that's what everything hinges on right now.
Totally.
The second point is a little bit analogous with the business world. Is there an analog in the current moment to that 1920s sense of deep fear of threat? And the answer is clearly no, right? There isn't a sense of where would it come from? The largest industrial dispute in the United States in 2021 took place on the campus of my university between the graduate students, militant graduates. So there's no labor challenge. And that, for me, then, is this question of how does this out-of-control far-right GOP relate to capital in the United States. And I don't think business knows either. I think they're beside themselves. Like, they used to have a party that would reliably vote for NAFTA, that would reliably vote for bailouts in 2008. And one of the key moments in the fracturing of the Republican Party is McCain's decision to choose Palin in the middle of the 2008 financial crisis, and the inability of the party managers to rally the GOP caucus in Congress behind TARP. The ultimate bailout. They couldn't get the Republican votes. They actually had to rely on the centrist Democrats to give them the votes. And from the understanding of America's power and the development of its economy, which remain pillars of America's global power, it's really difficult to see how this party you're describing so vividly relates to that, right? And I'm not saying this with any sense of a clear answer, because if you talk to senior American business figures, they don't know where to turn anymore. They no longer have a reliable anchor. Having said all of that, 2020 was, from this point of view, kind of strangely reassuring, because when things got real in March and April 2020, and it really looked again as though we were facing a systemic crisis, the majorities were there. They even did a bunch of really sophisticated central bank interventions, which many of us thought, us sort of centrist liberal internationalists thought, no, Trump will never do that. He didn't have any problem with central bank swap lines. They rolled them out. The Fed, acted the stabilizing hegemon that everyone expected. Hence my sense that maybe the story here is a kind of disarticulation between this phenomenon that you're describing so brilliantly in the political realm and these persistent structures of power on the other hand.
Is there a third force that could emerge? I know everyone says no, but it hasn't been there in American, but you're describing, it seems to me, a vacuum.
This is one of the poignant things is the bipartisan system, which was supposed to be a force of stability, and Americans would turn their noses up at all these multi-party systems and like places like Italy where the government can be dissolved easily. Well, it turns out that if you want to beat back extremism, having a multi-party system can be useful, because look where we are. People like Liz Cheney and who are moderates they have no home now. And it's been a big problem. I mean, there was an attempt recently to start a third party, including former Governor Christine Whitman, but it didn't really go anywhere, and the media didn't really cover it much in a serious way. So we're kind of stuck, and it makes it much more difficult to overcome the polarization and give people who don't want to be MAGA Republicans, Trumpist Republicans, extremists, they don't have anywhere to be.
It's about institution building by the sound of, the lack of an ability to believe there are institutions capable of being built. Nick?
Just to pick up on something that Adam said, Adam mentioned TARP. TARP was the huge financial relief package passed by the Bush administration in 2008, when there was this real worry in America that people would go to ATMs and not be able to pull out cash, that the whole the system would collapse. And it's really interesting, if you trace the roots of the Tea Party movement, the Tea Party is always characterized as a rejection against Obama and that it was racist, and in many ways, elements of it were. But the story that the Tea Party tells itself was a reaction to TARP. And it was actually a reaction to what they called big government conservatism. They hated the idea that government should intervene in the economy in that way, to bail it out. And again, it was one of those
They were going to be the recipients of precisely
exactly, the paradoxes. And it speaks of this radicalization of the Republican Party, that they would reject a kind of establishment figure like George W. Bush intervening in the economy in that way.
I think it's crucial to get that story. So the moment the Tea Party is launched is this notorious moment on American financial television where I'm not sure it was even Fox, but one
CNBC.
of they were covering the story. You remember it, right? And he's on the Chicago trading floor, which is like the toughest, most roughneck kind of chunk of American finance. And the reporters are talking amongst themselves, and they basically speak to the guy who does the trading floor, like, so, what's going to happen here is that, you're going to end up paying for your neighbor's bad mortgage. And at that point, he turns around to the traders on the floor and he says, do you like the sound of this? And it's like, there's a, no, hell no. And then he says, we should have a Tea Party. But so the nature of this protest is, I would insist, it is an anti-welfarist, anti-solidaristic, individualist kind of movement. And behind that, ultimately, when that sort of American hears the word welfare, they're ultimately thinking about transfers from the better off, more striving, more affluent, more disciplined, to the more
Non-whites.
feckless. And behind that is race.
Is race.
And the idea that a liberal, democratic, black president was going to preside over the opening of the coffers of the government to this kind of transfer is at the root. There's one reason why America does not have a welfare state in the healthcare area or in any other dimension. The single one-word best answer, if you've only got one word to answer it with, is race.
It's a very depressing point to come to. There's another issue, thinking of the famous Hillary Clinton remark, the basket of deplorables, which, our John Howard, ex-Prime Minister, said, like you sort of lose an election like that when you start speaking.
True.
The word contempt, just before we get on to our final bit, which is really looking at the sort of global positioning then, there's been a very interesting essay recently talking about the rise of contempt in social media particularly, but broader than that. In the popular discourse is full of groups' contempt for each other. And the word contempt is a very strong word, I think. And I wonder whether that is a way to... Is that what helps us to understand what is underway between groups in the United States? These incredible divisions. I don't know whether we fully understand it in Australia, to be honest. I just would like to hear what you think about that.
One of the ways that I think you can explain the paradox of this New York billionaire becoming a working class hero in the Rust Belt was this idea of contempt and a shared sense of victimhood. Donald Trump could speak to those white working class people in those huge rallies in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and appear before them as the victim of the same East Coast liberal elite sneering. And I think that explains at least some of the visceral connection.
Was that true at all? Was that true? Could you feel that?
It was for his audience. And Trump manipulated that so brilliantly, as others have done in the past. Trump managed to bring together a kind of demagogic tradition in America that came from people like George Wallace, this Southern segregationist who was really phenomenally successful, not just in the South, but in the North as well. His last presidential bid was cut short when he was an assassination attempt left him in a wheelchair. And he was doing really well at that stage. He had 1 million more votes than George McGovern, who ended up becoming the presidential nominee. Anyway, Trump managed to combine that demagogic tradition, I think, also with a kind of authoritarian tradition that runs through American politics as well, and sometimes was used by surprising figures in history. Lincoln, for instance, suspended habeas corpus. FDR tried to pack the Supreme Court, what was interpreted as a total. And he managed to fuse those things together. And one of the things that gave him this glue was this idea that we're victims of an elite, of a government, of a deep state that's always working against you and always working against people like you and me.
Ruth?
Yeah, one of the biggest scams of people like Trump is this kind of faux populism where they're talking about the globalists and they're inventing these enemies and trying to be for the heartland. And, nobody's a bigger globalist than Trump. His entire business model was licensing his name, besides money laundering for Russians and stuff, but licensing his name around the world, right? And Ivanka, well into the Trump administration, Ivanka was getting trademarks from the Chinese, from other countries. She had like 16 countries. So that's corruption. But this faux populism, where Orban, they all do it, all these far-right people, they pose as the defender of, national traditions, of America first. And so these people who are duped, the MAGA hats, everybody puts on their MAGA hat, which was brilliant, the tribalism. You have the hat, you have the chants. They were made in China, right? That's true. All of his stuff was made in China. So that's very compelling, though, and it's also, I find that very sad because I look at all the times in history where people were duped by people promising, to put national interests first, when instead, in the meantime, they're supported by a global offshore finance system. that's the other part of this, right?
Yes, it's just that you hear people these days, I can't remember who it was the other day, sort of saying, sorry. You're hearing it in lyrics, you're hearing it in commissioning, there's a sort of a sense I detect from the East Coast saying, my God, we've got to hear this and we've got to find a way to persuade people from the Rust Belt that we don't think they're contemptuous.
Yeah.
There's a real effort underway. I just am trying to work out how real it is and whether it'll last. And does it matter?
Well, you do. One of the things that the research shows, both people who work on authoritarian cults, people who work on disinformation, and people who work on cults, like other kinds of cults, is that when somebody's in a disinformation tunnel, the impetus may be to cast them off because it's too hard to talk to them. My own mother was radicalized during the pandemic from watching RT in England, and you couldn't. She became like a super white nationalist. You couldn't talk to her. So I stopped talking to her, and then I thought, well, that's silly. You know better. You have to keep talking to them. And that's what all the research says. And in talking to them, you are doing the opposite of showing contempt.
Right. And
right?
What's happened to you? What's happened to your mother's views?
Well, RT was kind of banned for a while, and so she went back.
There's an answer
No, but
for
she
you.
was actually, it was really scary and difficult for me because I work on this stuff, like professionally, and she said to me one day, because she got this hatred for Biden, who she liked before, and she said, Biden's not doing anything Putin wants him to do. Because she'd been led by RT to this is the Kremlin playbook, that you see the world through the eyes of what's best for the Kremlin. And so she's drawn back. But the contempt thing's very important to bring up, because the more people feel shamed and humiliated by elites or by others, the more they're going to be taking refuge in their disinformation tribes. That's what the research says.
Adam.
I mean, I know quite well this sense of tension within one's own family, which makes it difficult to avoid speaking in terms of people being duped. But are we really persuaded that that's the dynamic, or is it not, in some sense? It may not be a direct acknowledgement of a reality, but is it not actually a fairly frank acknowledgement of the reality that, in fact, Americans do hold each other? Americans have contempt for each other.
More than, say, in the UK?
No, in fact, in some ways it seems quite recognizable to me. In some ways you could simply say it's the politics of class articulating itself in a rather backwards kind of, kind of inverted kind of way, because obviously he's not an obvious choice as a working man's hero, except that liberal, cultured, educated Americans do have contempt for Trump. And so there is, as it were, just an affinity between groups which see themselves entirely correctly, entirely accurately, as being on the wrong end of a cultural gradient, and this guy who's on the wrong end of a cultural gradient, but at least he's rich and successful and has glamorous wives, and what's not to like? And so that's the structural alignment. It isn't that he represents working class America, it's just that he represents working class America's perception of itself as, and quite accurate, entirely accurate perception of itself as culturally marginalized and looked down upon by liberal elites. And so to that extent, it seems to me a kind of, I'm not sure whether I would describe it as duping, but there's also a sort of playful element. I'm not sure how many of them really believe all the bullshit. I'm sure most of them can read the label "Made in China" on the back. They know that's the case, and all the other goodies they've been enjoying also come from China. But that's not the point. The point is to wear a hat which makes liberals crazy. Yeah. And it really works. And I don't think there's any dupery there. Like, it totally works. It really horrifies and pisses off the idiots that voted for Clinton.
That's a great question. To what extent do people believe the bullshit? And I think that's something that we've seen a real shift in, especially during this primary season. I mean, we've seen 20 years of moderate Republicans being displaced by sort of more conservative Republicans, and then those more conservative Republicans were replaced by really radical Republicans. And a lot of those radical Republicans didn't believe the big lie, but they had to politically because they didn't want to be primaried by some Trump-endorsed candidate. But I think one of the really worrying things about this primary season is how we've got big lie true believers now.
Right, okay.
And we've not only got big lie true believers winning primaries that gives them the chance to get into Congress, we've got big lie true believers taking over some of the electoral the mechanics at the state level. The US Constitution, alas, gives so much power to state assemblies in federal elections. And that power now is being seized upon by these big lie Republicans at the state level. And that is such a danger to US democracy.
Okay, look, I mean, the paradox is that, and this is where I'd like to finish up, is that in some ways, globally, America's just never been more strong. It's the big supplier, the most, as you've been writing about, Adam, of armaments to Ukraine. It's made a huge decision, you know, to absolutely, if the Ukrainians are prepared to fight for their country, they'll back them completely. They're probably more capable of being self-sufficient, vastly more, if it all push came to shove, than China, vastly more. So it's odd, which you've alluded to earlier. You've got this amazing level of power on the one hand and solidity, and this is an important thing for Australia to talk about. And then you've got all of this incredible brittleness that you're all describing. Is this the polycrisis that you love to write about and terrify us about?
That's one of the reasons I've adopted this concept, is that it does seem to, I mean, and part of the multipolarity is, after all, one does have to think other countries as part of the story as well. And America is very fortunate right now in its antagonists. I mean, Putin, after all, has handed them the destruction of Russian military power, the humiliation of Russia's claims to be a great power on a plate. Now, it took courage on the American side to say, right, we're going to risk nuclear escalation, we're going to pile in here. I'm sure a bunch of people sat around saying, and we will not be able to forgive ourselves if we do not seize this opportunity. So yes, there's risks, but let's do it. And we'll, you know, no one knew the Ukrainians would be the hammer and the anvil that they've turned out to be, right? So, and on the other hand, they're also dealing with China, where the apparent invulnerability has really cracked, right? In the last couple of years, we've seen a series of moves which suggest that Beijing does not have the all-encompassing technocratic grip which many of us imagined it appeared to have. So they've gotten lucky in that respect, and that's a dynamic that we also have to figure in. And the Europeans are just incredibly slow to play their own, up to their own potential. So America is left almost by default as the organizing anchor of this system. Like, why are Germany and France and Britain and Italy not able to supply Ukraine with the weapons that it needs? These are not very sophisticated weapons. We just don't have the stockpiles.
We're supplying Bushmasters.
Yeah,
we're very
so
proud.
exactly, and what those are, like souped-up Land Rovers or something, right?
They want more of them.
So, but you see what I mean? Like this,
yes.
We cannot deal with the American story in isolation. It is part of an interconnected system.
But the point is, it's working. I suppose this goes back. That does not, again, suggest terminal decline.
Because these pillared power structures, I mean, the Trumpites talked in terms of the deep state. Again, they're not entirely wrong, right? There is indeed an apparatus of power in the United States which was hell-bent, essentially, on limiting his ability, in its terms, to blow the whole thing up, which included decisions like, can we please pull out of Syria? Can we please pull out of Afghanistan? These were entirely legitimate decisions the president was making that the American military were hostile to. And so those mechanisms, they continue to function. And the fundamental question, I keep repeating it, is, as it were, how those are articulated with the true believing big lie folks. Because that is not going to work, right? Those two things are not going to align at some point. Climate change, for instance, is actually going to be an issue for American power, and then you are going to have to find some way around this problem.
But we go back to nihilism. A lot of these people they don't care. I remember I did an interview in March 2020, beginning of the pandemic, and I said to the journalists that Trump doesn't care if you live or die. He just couldn't care less if Americans live or die. And people got very angry because it seemed like too bleak. How can you say that? Even people who didn't like Trump, they thought. But you have to see the aims of governance for people like, including talking about states, Ron DeSantis in Florida, who's gone after ESG business, who's gone after Disney, who's gone after the Special Olympics. Who goes after the Special Olympics? Just because he can, you know. He's a nightmare. He's a huge problem, and I've written a lot about him already. But these people are, they have their ideals. Their ideals are power and control. But they're nihilists, and so they're not that interested they don't really care in the same way. You have to use a different framework to think about them. I really think that.
Well, Nick, could they get to the point where, you know, you bring on your worst fear, you do push, and suddenly some of those pillars do fall over, and you've got a very, very different society? Would that terrify them back into realising there are consequences for playing like this?
Oh, look, I think you do have two Americas right now, and that's being codified in law, after Roe especially. You know, there's going to be an America where you can legally get an abortion and an America where you can't get an abortion. One thing we've seen sociologically over the last sort of 20 years or so is the big sort. People tend to congregate with like-minded people. We tend to talk of it as red and blue states. It's not as simple as that. Some of the biggest divisions are obviously between the cities and the countryside. And I wonder whether the best that we can hope for now is just a state of peaceful coexistence. I do worry about the threat of political violence. Again, there's a long tradition in America of political violence that we tend to sort of airbrush out of the country's history, but it's there. Many of the people on January the 6th were literally shouting 1776. They believed themselves to be acting in the noble spirit of the American Revolution. And that is deeply problematic. I mean, some people talk about the analogy with the Troubles. I'm not sure if that's entirely accurate, because I don't think we're going to be seeing American troops sort of patrolling the streets of major... I don't think we'll be seeing American troops patrol the streets of an equivalent of Belfast as they did during the Troubles that we had in Northern Ireland. But I do worry about the flashpoints. I do worry that they can turn violent. I mean, elections is one, controversial Supreme Court decisions is going to be another, controversial verdicts in trials like the Carl Rittenhouse, that vigilante who was found not guilty, another potential flashpoint. I really do worry about that, especially with the proliferation of guns. You know, we've spoken many times about one of the reasons we came back was we had an American daughter and we kind of wanted to protect her from America. And, you know, one of the reasons for that was gun violence. And, you know, all those kind of explosive ingredients, when you add them with the guns and you add them with this political party now which isn't really committed to democracy, that is hugely problematic.
Look, if one follows the idea of follow the money as a way of trying to actually work our way through, where you might possibly get some diagnoses and some prescriptions for the next stage of peace, can you see anything coming out of the world of capital then, Adam? I mean, this can't be in their interest to be sitting there thinking, who are we going to deal with? There must be some solutions there, some money going into something constructive, mustn't there?
I think it's a fascinating question. Structurally, it's the one that preoccupies me most, because I think that's where we're going to get huge tension. But I think you have to make a distinction between capital isn't one thing, right? It's sociologically incredibly varied. And yes, if you are, you know, Jamie Dimon or someone like that, you know, he's sort of Long Island conservative Democrat, potentially somebody who once upon a time might have voted for a Republican. But his fundamental problem is he's running a really big bank. And as he quite correctly said, to run a really big bank, you need two things, a lawyer and a shrink, right? Because it's a big, corporate, stressful, you're running a chunk of American society and you have to maintain that functionality. So you have very little scope there for idiosyncratic politics, and certainly civil wars are bad for business, so you're not... I mean, there was literally this amazing...
Checked and balanced capital.
You know, there was this amazing, like, you know... business service providing firm that does expense accounting software that felt necessary in the fall of 2020 to issue a statement to shareholders saying that they didn't think expense claims would be filed in the case of a civil war. So on the basis of that, they had a fiduciary obligation to speak out against the crazies, right? On the other hand, there are other sources of capital and money, and this we know also from the history of fascism, right, which are much more idiosyncratic. So one end of the spectrum is the big individual billionaire, who isn't the biggest billionaire or run the most significant slice, but has just got so much financial freedom they can swing one way or the other, and it's entirely up to them. This is the hedge fund money or casino money. And then non-negligibly and crucial for the Trump base are what used to be called the petty bourgeois or little capital, right? You're talking car dealerships, you know, conservative lawyers, again, people with net worth in the United States comfortably on the boundary of the 1% to 2%, which means you have net worth somewhere between maybe $1 million and $5 million. But that means you can pony up for local candidates. You can provide trucks. You can provide sponsorship. You become a booster. And that kind of money is crucial for sustaining the big lie, because you're not built into any big social structure. It's much more important that you're in good standing with other local influential people who are also touting their guns and living in these big suburban houses. That's where the money comes in. So again, there's a disconnect between liberal elite central banking kind of Davos type money and these realms.
And one really quick point is, if you look at political polarization, it really maps closely with income polarization in America. That you talk about a missing middle in politics, there's a missing middle in the economy. And those two things really track closely over the last 50
and yet
years.
it's remarkable to me as an interviewer how little American guests want to really talk about that. So that they want to do all the political analysis and this complexity, and they don't want to talk about that missing middle, which is a much more favoured part of an Australian discourse, I think you'd agree. I mean...
Or class. Nobody
right.
talks about class in the States. It's not done.
So it's not done. So inequality, is it rising up as part of this? Are people wrestling with this? I'm not sure they are, really.
Well, I'm not an economic analyst, but 2019 was the year of a global record for protests around the world. And a lot of those protests were about economic inequality. And as in Chile, they're the biggest protests since the 1980s under the dictatorship. And Black Lives Matter was predominantly about racial justice, but with 20 million people involved, it becomes about other things. It becomes about institutionalized racism's economic effects. So I think there are other ways in the States that protests against economic inequality get expressed, precisely because we don't have a mechanism to talk about it openly and talk about class.
Well, is it because there's also a revulsion at talking about overly wealthy people? That's the impression I get, that richness is still to become wealthy is pretty impressive, which it is in many ways, but it can go too far for the cohesion of your society. I get the impression that's still a tricky topic in the US.
I mean, you could almost say that inequality is a way of not talking about class, right? Because the two things are not the same thing. And that goes back to this point about the car dealership and the Trump voters. Because if you do the inequality numbers, it's evidently not the case that the poorest people in America vote for Trump. It's the poorest people in America are single black mums, right? And there's a lot of them, and they are deeply impoverished. America has some of the poorest people and they, of course, don't vote Trump. Most of them don't vote at all, and if they are going to vote, they're going to vote Democrat, right? The people who vote Trump are, in fact, a layer of white, working, lower middle class and upper middle class people that sit in the band in between. That's where the votes come from, right? Because the wealthy people are 1% of society, so they don't generate a voting base.
Just a really quick point. If you look at the social profiles of the people who've been charged in the January the 6th insurrection, I mean, Ruth, you probably speak to this greater authority, but it's an extraordinary amount of people who are in that category. Yeah. I think 25% are business owners, for instance.
Exactly.
Extraordinary stat.
Yeah, in fact, January 6th was like, Trump got together a bespoke, army of thugs, of extremists. But along with the sovereign sheriffs and the militias and the people who fit, what we might think of as extremists, there was a whole new category of people who have been studied who were not previously radicalized or affiliated, and yet they all showed up, and they've continued to be, because January 6th was a radicalizing event, further radicalization, but they were called middle class and middle-aged. They were like architects, owners of, computer firms, and so these are the people who showed up to breach the Capitol.
That's fascinating.
One of them was an actor in Friday Night Lights, which I just find extraordinary. Anyway.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in the 3 minutes we have left, I'm sorry, I was going to go to questions, but I've just found it too good a discussion. Is there any hope, then? Can you offer any? Do you see breaks to these logjams you've all described so beautifully, Adam?
Well, I'm not sure we should hope for a reconstitution of a unified United States. I mean, I'm actually quite, because historically it's rare, it's unusual, and we've absolutely no idea on what terms it would be unified at this point. So some sort of functional disarticulation, this modus vivendi, which you described quite nicely, between different parts of America with crucial, sustaining, integrative power functions maintained both for the United States and the rest of the world. For me, that's probably as much as we can reasonably hope for.
Ruth?
I agree at present. It's just not going to be possible. In fact, what Adam's saying is, there are plenty of politicians, the Trumps and the DeSantis, who would like to have a national unity, right? And they've succeeded in demonizing others, and so Democrats are now political enemies. So I think that, yes, the best that can be hoped for is a semi-peaceful coexistence of these different...
That would not tolerate a Trump return, would it? Would it tolerate a DeSantis victory?
Not really. DeSantis is... you know how Orban looks great because Putin's so awful? Because you don't hear about people falling out of windows in Hungary. DeSantis, nobody has the baggage of Trump. No one is as criminal and depraved as Trump. He's in his own... So DeSantis, who's really scary, looks moderate. And he's got 40 billionaires, but I think he's up to 45 billionaires who back him now. Who have not...
45 billionaires, you say?
Billionaires are backers of DeSantis. So he wouldn't be the person to allow the coexistence.
Can't confer charm on him from what one reads. He's exceptionally disciplined, but devoid of charm, is what I read, DeSantis. We'll see. Nick?
Look, the fact that you can still attract a big crowd to talk about American decline speaks about its cultural dominance still. And that will always be the case. I think its technological edge is under threat from China. A report this week saying it's sort of lagging behind now in AI and quantum computing and those kind of things that are going to be so necessary to win the 21st century. I really worry about what happens to America. Like I said at the beginning, division has been the default setting throughout its history. In some ways, it's surprising that America has only fought one civil war. And the best I think we can hope for is peaceful coexistence. But I don't see the country coming back together in a kind of way that, the America that I fell in love with when I was a teenager.
All right.
Pessimistic note to end on.
It is slightly pessimistic. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please thank our guests today?
This session was recorded live at Carriageworks, Sydney. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit the Ethics Centre website to find out more. Thank you.